Welcome to Visions of America, all stories, all people, all places. I'm Heather Marie Montilla, the National Director of PBS Books.
And I'm Cyndee Landrum, Acting Director of the Institute of Museum and Library Services. In anticipation of the 250th anniversary of our nation's independence, PBS Books and the IMLS have been committed to bringing lesser-known and untold stories of the people and places that have shaped our nation.
We'll start today's program by speaking with cultural leaders at the International African American Museum located in Charleston, South Carolina, and discover the important work that this institution is doing to lay the groundwork for people to learn more about their own unique American experience, as well as the efforts being made to preserve these important stories.
Heather, let's turn this conversation over to Laura Huerta Migus, IMLS Deputy Director for the Office of Museum Services, so that she can help us to uncover what this museum and other cultural institutions like it have to offer.
Thank you, Heather and Cyndee. Hi, I'm Laura Huerta Migus, the Deputy Director of Museum Services at the Institute of Museum and Library Services. I am thrilled to be here as Visions of America celebrates the lesser-known stories of African Americans and explores family connections by focusing on African American genealogy. Today, we investigate African American stories, journeys, people, and places. We start by visiting Charleston, South Carolina, with Dr. Tonya Matthews, President and CEO of the International African American Museum. The International African American Museum is newly opened and tells the unvarnished stories of the African American experience across generations, exploring the trauma and triumph that gave rise to a resilient people. I'll also be chatting with the director of the museum's Center for Family History, Dr. Brian Sheffey, to discuss this amazing new center. Now, let's welcome Dr. Tonya Matthews.
Hello.
Hello, welcome, Tonya. We're so glad to have you with us today.
It's good to see you, Laura.
So let's start talking about the museum, which has such an interesting story, and you're such an important part of it. So tell us more about the International African American Museum.
So the International African American Museum, which has the fantastic acronym of IAAM, and sitting right at the former port of Gadsden's Wharf. So we are overlooking the Atlantic Ocean, and there is beauty and power in that. But we actually understand that this Gadsden's Wharf was once the site of our nation's most prolific transatlantic slave trading port. So we've got power of place at our museum site. It grounds and anchors us, but it doesn't define us. We like to say we are the International African American Museum for two reasons. One, we go all the way back to origin stories, to modern times. But two, we talk about modern connections between the African diaspora all across the globe. And that includes, of course, the African American community right here in the United States.
Thank you for that introduction. Now, we know that the museum, from concept to opening, has a very special story. And so can you tell us more about when the idea for the museum began and a little bit about that journey from that ideation to opening?
Yeah, it was quite a journey, and I think it's a good learning story for all of us. It's 23 years plus from first public word of the museum to actually opening. We were initially announced, shall we say, in the State of the City address in Charleston in 2000 by former Mayor Joe Riley. And Mayor Riley had read a book that changed his life. And the book talked about the hidden history of enslaved people in the genealogy and the family stories of white Charlestonians, and how the families, the Black communities and the white communities were far more mixed than we gave credit for, with intertwining histories. For him, that was a hidden story, an untold story that needed to be unleashed. And from that, he thought, let's build a museum. But of course, a book inspires, but then the people take that story. So over the decades and decades long journey, more people came to the table. From Mayor Riley, then he invited Congressman Clyburn, and then they invited pastors and church leaders and community members. And we started talking about what it would be like to tell this story from the African American perspective. And ultimately, we became a first voice museum, meaning this is a Black history museum telling Black stories from Black Americans' perspective, as we take in sort of the full concept. And then we decided we're going to be in the heart of downtown Charleston, but even that had its changes. So we are now in a location that's actually different from the original site of the museum, but no one can argue that this isn't the perfect site for this museum right here on the waterfront where we ultimately ended up.
That's such a compelling story, and I think says so much about the vision and the size of will that's needed to bring an organization like IAAM to fruition. And you mentioned in that explanation the importance of the untold stories, especially about families in place that are grounding the work of IAAM. I'd like to ask you about some of your own quotes about your hopes for the museum, that with every exhibition, program, and resource that you're hoping to foster empathy and empower visitors with knowledge of the past. So how do you really see the museum doing that as you're in the early days of your opening as an institution?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I do think that empathy is key. This is not just a professional tactic for me. As part of my personal storyline, I try to be in this space of radical empathy, as I like to say, because I think, the power of immersing yourself in someone else's story is not just a gift of respect, but it's a moment of humility. It's a moment of selflessness that allows you to get in there, learn, understand, without being judged and without judging. And I think that has been some of the challenge that we've had around African-American history and these Black stories. The idea that we must get in there and judge, or that if we get in that space, we will be judged. What we show at the museum is that's not what happens at all. And the one thing that I know about humans, we love a good story. It's part of who we are. It's part of what makes a community. It's part of what makes our history. And so when you get into our museum, you see we're very intentional about the stories we share and the stories that we tell, right down to the fact that one of the key experiences in our museum is to unearth your own story. It's about you. It's about us. It's about everyone in that space. And so I think that with our exhibitions, having these amazing lead-ins, of course, we talk about names that folks know, right? There are some clear folks, the Dr. Kings, the Rosa Parks. In fact, we talk about the people who taught the Dr. Kings and the Rosa Parks. So maybe those are stories that you don't know, so that by the time you're trying to find your own story, you realize, yeah, your story does belong in a museum. And your story is also part of the stories that we're actually telling through each and every one of our exhibitions.
Well, I think that's such a powerful approach for museum work and as an experience. And I'm wondering, in all of that visionary implementation that you've helped to lead, is there something that's a favorite part of the museum for you personally? We know that everybody goes to a museum and they sort of have their favorite gallery or their exhibit or an object that really moves them. I wonder if there's something like that for you at IAAM.
So, of course, the problem with that question, it's like asking a parent, who's your favorite child? And so I feel bad about not calling out other exhibits. But I do have to say there are a couple of places I'm drawn to. One is actually on the exterior. So our museum is surrounded by the African Ancestors Memorial Gardens. designed by Walter Hood. So it's got all this artistic interpretation of the stories you find. And one of the things that you cannot miss are two prominent Black granite walls. The inside is smooth, the outside is rough. There are these kneeling, hunched figures between those walls, obviously representing the people whose stories we're about to tell. But then on the outside of that wall, we've inscribed a line from Maya Angelou's poem, "And Still I Rise." And for me, that is the epitome of this intersection of trauma and joy, of resilience and restoration. And I have a side life as a poet, so I definitely resonate every time the museum uses poetry. So I notice things like whenever I'm giving a tour of the museum, I actually always start there. So, if I'm asked the question and I have to think through, that is probably one of the most important and powerful parts of the museum that speaks to me personally.
Well, I love that, and I can't wait to come and visit. The next question I want to ask you is really related to our larger reason for having this conversation and for the Visions of America series, which is to start awareness and dialogue and motivation for people across the country to be aware of and be engaged with commemorating the upcoming 250th anniversary of the founding of our nation. And so I'd really like to ask you, Tonya, why you think that IAAM and other institutions like the museum are so important for being a part of the dialogue and then the commemoration of our coming semi-quincentennial.
Wow, the anniversary is coming. And I think every history museum in America has been gearing up. And I think one of the things that's really important about this and why museums and our sisters institutions of libraries will play such an important part is museums are one of the last places on the planet where it's okay to learn in public. If we think about the way our conversations are going and everyone's supposed to show up and know everything and be perfect and have all the answers, there are very few places where you can go because you don't know something. And everyone else in there with you is there for the exact same reason, because we don't know and we're excited about the fact that we don't know. So we found this place. So you go into a museum, it's a place for public learning. And I can tell you, if you go into a museum and you know everything that's in there, the comment will be, it looked good, but I didn't learn anything. So it's considered not a good thing. If you go to a museum and they're not telling a story, or at least part of a story that you didn't know. And I think that as we celebrate the full history, this milestone anniversary for the nation, there are a lot of stories that we don't know about our own country. And we need a place where we're excited to learn about it. And the people surrounding us are excited to learn with us and excited to see us learn. So that's why I think that museums are going to be essential as we kick off these celebrations.
Well, thank you for that. And I think what's so powerful about the work that you and your team are doing in Charleston is that you're stewarding many, many important American stories, but from a very, very local perspective. And from a perspective that maybe don't necessarily see themselves connected to 1776. But we know that they are a part of that story, connecting us from then, before then even, till today. I'd love to ask you one more question, just to dive a little bit deeper into the work of the Genealogy Center, and that's coming out from that for the museum about the untold stories of families in Charleston. And can you tell us a little bit more about what that looks like in the museum?
So one of the things I think to your point that we do and we showcase is we start with South Carolina and we start with Charleston, And then we translate that into the national story, into the international story. So, we are a global museum, but it all starts at home, and it has its roots. And that's what we want for folks to understand about their own genealogy. Now, because Charleston was such a major entry point for enslaved people from the continent of Africa, it means that a lot of African American history will find its roots right back here in Charleston, right back here in South Carolina. Even prior to the Great Migration of the 1940s, folks were migrating out of this space. Folks were being forced to migrate out of this space as we were transporting the enslaved people to the places where they would be worked in those ways. So when you talk about looking at your genealogy, it's why we have to be connected to the largest genealogy databases in the world. It's why we are setting up partnerships with state archives in other countries where the African diaspora landed, because of all of these connections that do in fact lead right back to Charleston, to our ports of entry, to Gadsden's Wharf, where the museum is located. But the mission of the museum, the first part of our mission, is to honor the untold stories. And we play with the word untold, because sometimes by untold, we mean buried, we mean hidden, we never mean forgotten, but sometimes we do mean feared as we go back into these stories. And I think that the challenge with trying to avoid all of the demons and the enemies is that then you lose sight of the heroes and the victories and all of those stories. And each of our backgrounds has all of that combined. But I will tell you what I found out here in South Carolina. Folks down here, we love to tell a good story. And if you wind people up and you ask them the right question, they've got a little bit more understanding of their own genealogy and family history than they ever thought. And we just help them along with the process.
Well, that's such a beautiful opportunity. And I think really confirms why organizations like IAAM are so important for us as a country, and also why we're so grateful for you making time to share about all of the treasures and gifts of this institution with us as we work on our own journey for engaging the country in commemorating the semi-quincentennial. So Tonya, thank you so much for your time and your extraordinary insights today.
Wonderful. It was great talking with you, Laura. I really enjoyed this.
We are excited to continue our conversation with Dr. Brian Sheffey, Director of the Center for Family History at the International African American Museum. Welcome, Brian.
Hi, how are you?
I'm well, thank you. So glad that you're here with us to share the story of the center today.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. I really look forward to having a chat.
Well, let's dive right into it. So we've had an introduction to the mission and the vision of the International African American Museum already, but we really want to take some time to learn more about the important family story work that you all do in the Center for Family History. So tell us a little bit more about the center and what it does.
Well, thank you. One of the things that I like to start with is the museum as a whole is about telling the untold stories from the African American experience in the United States and back in the British colonial period. So while the other side of the museum tells those really large, overarching African American historical stories, what we do is we get the individual pebbles, people's individual family histories. It could be something about one ancestor in particular that we feature in the center in a variety of ways. We have a story wall, we have stories on our kiosks, and each one of those individual stories actually leads back to one of those large overarching stories. So it could be something about how someone's grandmother left Charleston, South Carolina, and went to New York as part of the Great Migration. So you learn about her story in our department, but on the other side of the museum, you learn about the Great Migration of African Americans out of the South into the North in the Midwest and the West at the same time.
Wonderful. And, we know that there's a boom of interest in family history and in genealogy, across the country and around the world. And so from your perspective, how is the center maybe different or special from some of the other places where people can investigate their ancestors and conduct genealogical research?
Okay. One of the main things that we hope that we do, besides kind of entertaining and educating people and inspiring them, is to get people to feel empowered to actually do the research. Because there's so much mythology about what African Americans can and can't do in terms of getting beyond like the 1870 census. That was the first census where at least enslaved African Americans were enumerated with their full names on a census. Free people of color, different story. They're in censuses all the way back to the first one in the 1790s. And again, it's about getting people to understand the information that's available, the records that are available, where they can find them, and how powerful a journey it is to start finding the names of your ancestors and speaking them out loud. And I'll give a really quick example. Even though I was born in this country, I lived outside, mostly in England for the majority of my life. And I didn't get a sense of my own American identity until I started doing my genealogy and realized that I had enslaved ancestry that I could trace all the way back to the 1600s in Virginia.
Wow. That's really powerful. And, it really actually leads me to my next question about the center. We know that this museum has not only local roots there in Charleston, but also global connections. And as people think about the center as a resource, how might they find themselves there? Who is the center for?
I'm going to say the center really is for the children of the African diaspora. So even though it's largely what the reference books that we have in our reference library, the genealogical database and record data sets and books that we have on our research iPads where people can come in and they can actually do their family research. Those are really powerful tools. And it's not, as I said, just US focused. There's resources where people can look up colonial records in British America on the British National Museum or Archives website. We have a memorandum of understanding with the government of Barbados. We're working to get records from that source. And again, in our reference library, we have slave deeds and slavery-related books dealing with the different Caribbean islands, as well as, I believe, one for Belize even. Started to build out that kind of Mexican, Latin American, South American slavery story within our resources.
That's wonderful. It's very interesting to hear already that you have users that are across the spectrum of experience and expertise. So with that, I'd actually like to talk a little bit more about the center and what it's like. You've mentioned already some of the interactives that are there, like iPads for folks to research in your family search kiosks. But I wonder if you could walk us through a little bit what it's like for a person who is coming to the center for the first time and what they might expect to see as an experience.
When I'm actually on the floor, I always have to smile because as soon as people walk into our space, they kind of stop. And you can tell they're seeing things that they weren't expecting. And I think most people come into our space with a very open mind. They're not sure what's here, and they're really not sure what's available and what their experience is going to be. So as soon as you walk through the door on the right-hand side, there's this wonderful thing called Story Booth. And it's like a little mini recording studio. People can go in and they can either record on audio only or do a video clip, which they can actually email to themselves. And they're 2-minute clips, and they can either talk about a family member where their family came from or what they'd like to learn more about their family. Then as they come more into the space, they're surrounded by 2 story walls that feature 10 stories that people were very generous in sharing about their ancestry and ancestral stories. We have 4 information kiosks, which provide information about how to get started doing your genealogy, factors to consider when you're doing it. Another part introduces this wonderful web service called FamilySearch.org, which is like the free version of Ancestry that has just hundreds upon hundreds of millions of records that people can actually access right here in the center, or, so long as they have an account with Family Search, they can access them anywhere. But we do have that available here. And then we have another feature that's called Community Stories. And we have centenarian stories, so people who are 100 years old or above. Although I cheat, we do start with 90-year-olds because as far as I'm concerned, if you've been on this earth for 90 years, you have some stories to tell, and you've seen a lot. So to get them to share their living history, and that becomes part of our actual living archive in the museum. So and we have a wonderful one about Mrs. Chillis. She's a 109-year-old woman born on James Island, just outside of Charleston. She was born in 1914 during one of the most famous or infamous hurricanes in South Carolina history, and she recounts it. She recounts the story that she was told about the day that she was born. These are just wonderful stories. So thinking that this is Black History Month, and while I will always pay my respects to the big looming luminary names that we all get taught about and known, I actually love these stories even more because they're stories that historians would have never covered, don't write about, and overlook.
So is there a way for people who feel like they might be holding materials that could be important to contribute to get in touch with you?
Yeah. The best way to get in touch with us is by email. The email address to send those kind of queries or offers of donating is C for Charlie, F for Frank, H for Henry at IAAmuseum.org.
That's wonderful. And
it's a really simple process. We will respond. We create Dropbox folders for them to be able to upload that content to.
That's wonderful. What an excellent opportunity for expanding the stories that you all are able to tell. Well, Brian, I'd love to move to my last question for you, and it's a bigger scale question. You've talked so much about the intentional and thoughtful design and engagement that you all offer through the center. But I'd really like to ask you, as the director, what your larger aspiration for the center is.
I suppose one of the larger overarching ones is to kind of establish our reputation in the space, in the kind of genealogical and museum space. It is not usual for a museum to have a Center for Family History. The the Smithsonian African American Museum certainly has one. I'm aware of the Underground Railroad Museum, which I believe is in Ohio. Correct me if I'm wrong on that one. They also do, but it's not usual to come into a museum and for there to be a functioning family history center and a place for people to be able to research. I think that's a really powerful thing for us to be able to do, and to make that link between individual history and the overarching nature of African American history in the country.
So, Brian, do you have any final thoughts or takeaways for us?
One thing that I hope that people will take away from this conversation is African Americans, basically Black people of the African diaspora, we know the worst things that could have possibly happened to our ancestors. And I'm just hoping that fear of discovering that, or fear of how your people would handle that, is preventing them from actually doing research. Because actually knowing who you come from and knowing where you come from is one of the most profoundly rewarding and insightful and enlightening things It certainly has been for me. One of the most enlightening things I've ever done in my life.
Well, I can't think of a better motivator and invitation for folks to come and visit the museum and take advantage of all the resources of the Center for Family History there. So thank you so much for your time and for speaking to me today.
Thank you very much.
Now, I'll turn it back over to Heather and Cyndee.
Wow, IAM does such an amazing job telling the individual stories that shape the African American experience here in the United States. It's those individual stories, those personal stories, that really have set people on the path to finding their own stories and their own family journeys.
Well, Cyndee, I couldn't agree more. I thought it was fantastic to learn so much about IAM. And now we are joined by IMLS's own Anthony Smith, who sits down with Dr. Laverne Gray from Syracuse University to explore their journeys of discovery and the importance of continuing these traditions for generations to come.
Thank you so much, Heather and Cyndee. My name is Anthony Smith. I'm the Associate Deputy Director for Discretionary Grants for library programs within the Institute of Museum and Library Services. Now, in my off time as a librarian, I've also been somewhat of a genealogy hobbyist over the past 34 years. My effort has been to try and make sense of my own ancestral identity, which is why I'm so excited to have this conversation today with a true genealogy professional, a longtime friend and colleague. It's really a very special honor to be here today with Dr. Laverne Gray, assistant professor with the School of Information Studies at Syracuse University. Dr. Gray received multiple awards of recognition for her dissertation work titled "In a Collective Voice, Uncovering the Black Feminist Information Community of Activist Mothers in Chicago Public Housing from 1955 to 1970. And it is really nice to be here with you today, Dr. Gray. Thank you for making time for us.
Thank you so much, Anthony. I'm very happy to be here.
I'm thinking maybe we can start with you sharing with folks a bit about your dissertation work.
And yeah, when I think about my dissertation, that work actually started 20 years ago. Not that I was in the program, but it was when I was studying to be a librarian, and I had access to databases which featured journal articles and newspapers, and I searched the Chicago Defender for my grandmother's name. It was just a one-off, just wanted to see if she was represented. And I found this news article, and it was titled "Parent Blasts City Officials for Lack of Library in Community." And I said, this can't be right. And I saw the word library, and I was excited because I was in library school or training to become a librarian. And it was her voice. And she was blasting city officials, which at that time in around 1963 included Mayor Daley, Richard Daley. And I was fascinated by that. And it started me on a path that resulted in that particular work. It was me looking for her, but what I found was a community.
Yeah, that's so awesome. I mean, that was 60 years ago, and it's interesting. It sounds like you had no knowledge that your grandmother was engaged in this kind of work. Specifically around her work to lobby for a library. I think that's the irony here, right?
Right. Yeah, and what was fascinating, there were a series of articles included in the Chicago Defender and the Chicago Tribune of this particular movement of these women. And I had no inkling. Actually, my mom, her daughter, was unaware as well. that they had did that much. She knew that what she did was community work. And that's just the way we spoke about it in our household. And in my interactions with her, I knew that she worked at the community level, maybe not as intense when she got older around the time I came along, but it was essentially community work.
So it was the Henry Booth Settlement House where your grandmother was engaged in her community work. I find it fascinating, extremely fascinating. This was 1963, which was, over 60 years ago. But it's my understanding that all of those records are still intact and available through the University of Illinois, Chicago, which is so exciting.
Yes, it is. And they also have the Jane Addams Whole House records. They're another settlement house records. I guess it's kind of fantastic that those are available. As people who research families and communities, especially those that don't have a rich record trail, say, for instance, people living in public housing, to have that settlement house located there. And keep in mind that it was moved there in 1955. They made the choice to move to service those in the newly built public housing, including the Harold Ickes homes and the Dearborn homes. And so they made a conscious choice to relocate themselves there in the public housing community. And all of the records from meetings of community members, activities, adult education, which developed into this kind of library project for the women. There were social work reports. And so you can see how people are moving on the ground. And the evidence and things that I found in the newspaper really coincide with a lot of those activities. So it's a gold mine. Otherwise, I would only know, and not saying it's not less rich, through oral history, which is also important, but to have the record of these meetings with minutes of these mothers being very upset that their children don't have access to educational opportunities is wonderful.
Yeah, and it was all about education, right, for them. Yeah,
Exactly.
It's so cool.
Mhm.
We had a settlement. It was called the South Side Settlement House where I grew up in Columbus, and I know of friends of mine who one friend of mine who his older brother worked at the settlement house, and I never really fully understood it as a kid, and quite honestly, I thought it was the Cinnamon House. They were saying at the time. And so that was what I knew for a long time, was that it was the Cinnamon House. Talk a little bit about your this whole concept of information community and the idea of sort of centralizing community. I think you use this in your dissertation work and now even in your grant work. Can you share a little bit more about that?
Okay. And when I talk about an information community, especially in terms of the dissertation work, it was how I identified who these women were. It's in the Black feminist context. So it's these group of women, and information for them was not outside of themselves. It was within the context of this kind of sharing and being in communion and being in a shared community space. And so information was more embodied. It was more used as a tool for community support and help. It wasn't an individual going out trying to find something or to know something. It was them doing this from a collective standpoint. So they were together working through these their issues. And when I mean issues, or the needs of the community.
Yeah, that's awfully powerful. And So Dr. Gray is also the recipient of an IMLS funded grant titled Uncovering Black Lives Project, investigating the information community and collections of African American genealogists. This current work focuses on African American genealogy by examining people and organizations involved in the practice. Can you share a bit more with our audience about this work?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And I'm very excited about it because it is rooted in that kind of dissertation work where I was looking at an individual, but found a community and named it my ancestral community, knowing that the one person I was searching for was not the absolute, right? And I knew that these kind of communities where information happens is not unique necessarily to the Black experience, but it's a rich platform to draw from. And so I imagined that these same type of communities exist amongst those who are doing work in looking for ancestors. All types of genealogy work from any standpoint. They don't have to be professionals or anything, but those that are like yourself, hobbyists, even if it's over 34 years or just 1 month, but to see how this community nurtures that search for ancestors, right? And also what kind of materials they find and use, and how they uncover their family histories, right? What are their processes, right? And how do they help one another through that? So the information is not just the evidence, it's the existence of the community to support that evidence.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I'm really looking forward to the wrap up. But I realize that, this is work that's currently in progress.
Yes.
You wrote in your proposal, the work of the African American genealogist reflects the continuity of the struggles to resist placement of the Black experience at the margins. I think this speaks volumes about the need for your work. Can you talk a bit about the need and really what attracted you to this? I think you've mentioned that you've talked a little bit about it, but if there's more you can share about that.
Yeah. Well, if I go a little bit way back, and I'll tell my age with this, and it was how touched I was at the time when Alex Haley's Roots was shown on television. And keep in mind, I was a very young girl in first grade, primary level, but being actually emotionally moved by that. And it was moved by that kind of discovery. And the title of his book, The Roots, the Saga of an American Family. And so as I grew in reading and studying, I understood that he placed center stage that that particular American family story. And what this project is doing is understanding how people center these family stories, right? And so it's not necessarily a search for Black roots that are somewhere hidden or somewhere underneath or somewhere that you drive by, like with the public housing example. But it really centers this kind of not only the persons, but the communities in which they lived. And so that's one of the objectives of the research, is to kind of center that family existence, and to know that people are connected in that way. And that's really was the inspirational point for me going way back. but sometimes things sit with you for a long time. And I see that as I discover more, read more literature about it, and engage with those people who do the work formally and informally, it's a truly an eye opener.
Yeah, I don't know if you had a chance to visit the Alex Haley farm while you were in.
Yes,
but it's very special, the special place. And, I have similar kinds of memories and around Roots and that whole series when it aired in 1976 certainly impacted me as well and put me on a journey. So one of your research questions seeks to understand familial collection building processes being used by genealogists as part of this grant work that you're doing. Can you talk a bit about what you are seeing so far, understanding that it's still a work in progress, right?
Okay. Outside, I'll tell this part. I'll give like a sneak peek. And what I'm seeing with these kind of collection building activities for those who practice is the use of creativity to attempt to tell the story. So you might see artistic expressions, things beyond the traditional family tree. There's a lot of, because of our access to digital making technologies, people are telling these stories in different ways and using the actual materials that they have or evidence or artifacts or other types of materials to tell stories in different ways. So there's more artistic and creative expression around this.
Yeah, I'm always excited and pleased to see the younger generations engaged in genealogy work and ready to pick up the torch. And I'm struggling with that with my own personal genealogy research these days. Do you have any examples that come to mind? That the concept of this sort of artistic expression is really, really interesting. If there's any examples you have of that.
Well, it's not so much different from the storytelling through quilting, right? And so, which is traditional, correct? And so what we have now is access to digital materials where you can even patchwork photographs, present something visually aesthetic wise, where the story is not the line and it's not the names and the vital dates, but it becomes this image, this powerful image. It's like a magical representation of what ancestry looks like.
Do you feel like that's a result of us having to sort of fill in the blanks?
That's a good question, Anthony. I think so. I think it is because, but it also connects what I believe that that emotion, all right, to be able to discover oneself. Scholars have who also research this area in terms of the technology and the DNA representation. There's a lot of emotion that goes into that, and those particular results take someone to a different level in understanding who they are as human beings as they exist in the United States. So any type of expression of that brings kind of reconciliation to them to better know themselves, to understand their placement in this nation on this side of the world, and understand the uniqueness of their culture and their history and how they fit into history.
Can you talk a little bit about the importance of the collection and artifacts of African American genealogists, and what are some of the unique challenges you're seeing with the collection work that's happening in this arena?
What I see as a unique challenge is the run towards evidence in a way. All right. And so traditionally in actuality through genealogical work, there's a process that one must go through. And because also this is another wonder, and also something that can be a deterrent, is the instant access to so many records online, where one could just go and identify something and just start from there, not understanding what the process involved in connecting those dots and understanding evidences, the placement in history and the placement in community. There's sometimes a leap forward, so to speak, that can be deceptive in the process. And you may notice that I'm using the word process a lot because one has to be systematic in this. And what our current technological and cultural environment, it encourages you to just grab at things, right? And so that, it's like, oh, I found this in 1880 and that's it. That's the whole story. And so in a sense, as researchers and in a community where you can support one another, you can talk a little bit more about geography and location, and talk a little bit more about historical context, and not just the record that you happen to find in a free database online.
Yeah, I in 34 years, I've not been very systematic. So another reason why I'm looking forward to your published work.
Requirement, but we have to think about process more than product. That's the type of society we live in. We think about how there's instantaneous products. So
I'm getting the signal that we're running out of time. But I did want to just quickly ask about the aspiring genealogists, or even the seasoned genealogists, like, how you see this work being helpful to them, including myself.
Right. And what the work is really trying to uncover is what these communities look like, what they represent, how they support one another in these processes, even if it's a group of folks that do some instantaneous work and believe that tells the whole story. It's supposed to uncover what those connective threads look like. And also a bonus of this is looking at unique text and reference sources that are specific to the Black community that can be used as a resource for libraries and librarians and those that work in professional genealogy to help get that information out to the general public. It's important that people know what these connections look like and how it can benefit them. And it helps uncover history more, so we all become our joint historians and evidence chasers and process builders. So it's like a learning community around this.
Well, we're all excited and looking forward to your work. Looks like we're running out of time, but Dr. Gray, thank you for your extraordinary insights and for sharing with us about your important work. I'm very much anticipating the outcomes. Will have a huge implication for libraries and their ability to be successful in supporting African American genealogy research. So thanks again.
Thank you so much. I appreciate this.
And now I get to turn it back over to Heather and Cyndee to sort of close out the show.
Thank you so much, Anthony and Lara, for leading these conversations that capture the importance of the work being done by institutions like the International African American Museum, as well as genealogists and scholars who are the caretakers of our collective stories.
Heather, as you know, IMLS and PBS Books are committed to fostering conversations through museums, libraries, and their communities that tell these local stories that truly demonstrate the rich history of the American story. It's our belief that these trusted civic and cultural institutions must play a critical role in restoring these lesser and untold stories to their rightful place in our collective history. We hope that others are inspired to learn more about the power and joy of their own history and the part it plays in our national story and our shared ideals.
To learn more on this topic and to view our full library of programs, extended conversations, and more, visit visionsofamerica.org. And don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss an episode. On behalf of PBS Books and the Institute of Museum and Library Services, thank you for joining us.